Pyramids of Giza. Also known as Ahramat al-Giza, Pyramids of Giza. Arabic, Ahramat al-Giza. Giza also spelled, Giza. Date, c. 2456. Major events, Battle of the Pyramids. Key people, Sir Flinders Petrie, Augusta Mariette, Giovanni Battista Belzoni, George Andrew Reisner, Khufu. What's inside the Pyramids of Giza? The Pyramids of Giza are mostly solid masses of stone with very little to be found inside. Like many ancient Egyptian pyramids, those of Khafra and Menkaure have passageways at their base that lead to small subterranean burial chambers underneath each pyramid. Khufu's pyramid also has underground tunnels, but the burial chamber is located in the center of the structure, accessible via a climb up a tight interior passageway. Contrary to what one might expect, there are no hieroglyphic texts, treasures, or mummies in any of Pyramids of Giza. Decoration inside pyramids began several centuries after those of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure were constructed. Moreover, any treasure would have been plundered in ancient and medieval times, a fate that likely affected the bodies of the kings, which have never been found. Pyramids of Giza, 3rd Dynasty, c. 2575, c. 2465 BCE, pyramids erected on a rocky plateau on the west bank of the Nile River near Al-Giza, Giza, in northern Egypt. In ancient times they were included among the 7 wonders of the world. The ancient ruins of the Memphis area, including the pyramids of Giza, Actra, Dashur, Abu Ruwaish, and Abu Ar, were collectively designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. The designations of the pyramids Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure correspond to the kings for whom they were built. The northernmost and oldest pyramid of the group was built for Khufu, Greek, Cheops, the second king of the 4th dynasty. Called the Great Pyramid, it is the largest of the 3, the length of each side at the base averaging 755.75 feet, 230 meters, and its original height being 481.4 feet, 147 meters. The middle pyramid was built for Khafra, Greek, Chephren, the 4th of the 8 kings of the 4th dynasty. The structure measures 707.75 feet, 216 meters, on each side and was originally 471 feet, 143 meters, high. The southernmost and last pyramid to be built was that of Menkaure, Greek, Mycerinus, the 5th king of the 4th dynasty. Each side measures 356.5 feet, 109 meters, and the structure's completed height was 218 feet, 66 meters. All 3 pyramids were plundered both internally and externally in ancient and medieval times. Thus, the grave goods originally deposited in the burial chambers are missing, and the pyramids no longer reach their original heights because they have been almost entirely stripped of their outer casings of smooth white limestone. The Great Pyramid, for example, is now only 451.4 feet, 138 meters, high. That of Khafra retains the outer limestone casing only at its topmost portion. Constructed near each pyramid was a mortuary temple, which was linked via a sloping causeway to a valley temple on the edge of the Nile floodplain. Also nearby were subsidiary pyramids used for the burials of other members of the royal family. Khufu's pyramid is perhaps the most colossal single building ever erected on the planet. Its sides rise at an angle of 51 degrees 52 minutes and are accurately oriented to the 4 cardinal points of the compass. The Great Pyramid's core is made of yellowish limestone blocks, the outer casing, now almost completely gone, and the inner passages are of finer light-colored limestone, and the interior burial chamber is built of huge blocks of granite. Approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone were cut, transported, and assembled to create the 5.75 million-ton structure, which is a masterpiece of technical skill and engineering ability. The internal walls as well as those few outer casing stones that still remain in place show finer joints than any other masonry constructed in ancient Egypt. Britannica Quiz. Wonders of the World Quiz. The entrance to the Great Pyramid is on the north side, about 59 feet, 18 meters, above ground level. A sloping corridor descends from it through the pyramid's interior masonry, penetrates the rocky soil on which the structure rests, and ends in an unfinished underground chamber. From the descending corridor branches an ascending passageway that leads to a room known as the Queen's Chamber and to a great slanting gallery that is 151 feet, 46 meters, long. At the upper end of this gallery, a long and narrow passage gives access to the burial room proper, usually termed the King's Chamber. This room is entirely lined and roofed with granite. From the chamber two narrow shafts run obliquely through the masonry to the exterior of the pyramid. It is not known whether they were designed for a religious purpose or were meant for ventilation. Above the King's Chamber are 5 compartments separated by massive horizontal granite slabs. The likely purpose of these slabs was to shield the ceiling of the burial chamber by diverting the immense thrust exerted by the overlying masses of masonry. The question of how the pyramids were built has not received a wholly satisfactory answer. The most plausible one is that the Egyptians employed a sloping and encircling embankment of brick, earth, and sand, which was increased in height and in length as the pyramid rose. Stone blocks were hauled up the ramp by means of sledges, rollers, and levers. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, the Great Pyramid took 20 years to construct and demanded the labor of 100,000 men. This figure is believable given the assumption that these men, who were agricultural laborers, worked on the pyramids only, or primarily, while there was little work to be done in the fields, i.e., when the Nile River was in flood. By the late 20th century, however, archaeologists found evidence that a more limited workforce may have occupied the site on a permanent rather than a seasonal basis. It was suggested that as few as 20,000 workers, with accompanying support personnel, bakers, physicians, priests, etc., would have been adequate for the task. To the south of the Great Pyramid near Khafre's Valley Temple lies the Great Sphinx. Carved out of limestone, the Sphinx has the facial features of a man but the body of a recumbent lion. It is approximately 240 feet, 73 meters, long and 66 feet, 20 meters, high. See Sphinx. In 1925 a pit tomb containing the transferred burial equipment of Khufu's mother, Queen Hetepheres, was discovered near the upper end of the causeway of Khufu. At the bottom of a deep stone-filled shaft was found the queen's empty sarcophagus, surrounded by furniture and articles of jewelry attesting to the high artistic ability and technical perfection of the 4th dynasty craftsmen. Surrounding the 3 pyramids are extensive fields of flat-topped funerary structures called mastabas, arranged in a grid pattern. The mastabas were used for the burials of relatives or officials of the kings. Besides the core mastabas of the 4th dynasty, numerous mastabas from the 5th and 6th dynasties, c. 2465, c. 2150 BCE, have been found around and among the earlier structures. In the late 1980s and 90s, excavations in the environs of the pyramids revealed laborers' districts that included bakeries, storage areas, workshops, and the small tombs of workers and artisans. Mud ceilings seem to date the workshop areas to the late 4th dynasty. The tombs range from simple mud brick domes to more elaborate stone monuments. Statuettes were found within some of the structures. Hieroglyphic inscriptions on tomb walls occasionally identify the deceased. This article was most recently revised and updated by Tegan Wilder. Ancient Egypt. Date, 3000 BCE, 332. Major events, Battle of Kadesh. Key people, Ptolemaic dynasty Moses Akhenaten plot Enus Ramses II. Related topics, Egyptian art Ancient Egyptian religion Hieroglyphic writing Library of Alexandria Egyptology. Related places, Egypt Luxor Ancient Middle East Byblos Tanis. News. September 17, 2025, 3:14 a.m. Eastern Time, Jerusalem Post. Ancient Egypt, civilization in northeastern Africa that dates from the 4th millennium BCE. Its many achievements, preserved in its art and monuments, hold a fascination that continues to grow as archaeological finds expose its secrets. This article focuses on Egypt from its prehistory through its unification under Menes, Narmer, in the 3rd millennium BCE, sometimes used as a reference point for Egypt's origin, and up to the Islamic conquest in the 7th century CE. For subsequent history through the contemporary period, see Egypt. For a list of ancient Egyptian dynasties, see List of dynasties of ancient Egypt. For a list of Egyptian kings from the pre-dynastic through Ptolemaic periods, see List of pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Life in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt can be thought of as an oasis in the desert of northeastern Africa, dependent on the annual inundation of the Nile River to support its agricultural population. The country's chief wealth came from the fertile floodplain of the Nile Valley, where the river flows between bands of limestone hills, and the Nile Delta, in which it fans into several branches north of present-day Cairo. Between the floodplain and the hills is a variable band of low desert that supported a certain amount of game. The Nile was Egypt's sole transportation artery. The first cataract at Aswan, where the riverbed is turned into rapids by a belt of granite, was the country's only well-defined boundary within a populated area. To the south lay the far less hospitable area of Nubia, in which the river flowed through low sandstone hills that in most regions left only a very narrow strip of cultivable land. Nubia was significant for Egypt's periodic southward expansion and for access to products from farther south. West of the Nile was the arid Sahara, broken by a chain of oases some 125 to 185 miles, 200 to 300 kilometers, from the river and lacking in all other resources except for a few minerals. The eastern desert, between the Nile and the Red Sea, was more important, for it supported a small nomadic population and desert game, contained numerous mineral deposits, including gold, and was the route to the Red Sea. To the northeast was the Isthmus of Suez. It offered the principal route for contact with Sinai, from which came turquoise and possibly copper, and with southwestern Asia, Egypt's most important area of cultural interaction, from which were received stimuli for technical development and cultivars for crops. Immigrants and ultimately invaders crossed the isthmus into Egypt, attracted by the country's stability and prosperity. From the late 2nd millennium BCE onward, numerous attacks were made by land and sea along the eastern Mediterranean coast. At first, relatively little cultural contact came by way of the Mediterranean Sea, but from an early date Egypt maintained trading relations with the Lebanese port of Byblos, present-day Jebel. Egypt needed few imports to maintain basic standards of living, but good timber was essential and not available within the country, so it usually was obtained from Lebanon. Minerals such as obsidian and lapis lazuli were imported from as far afield as Anatolia and Afghanistan. Britannica Quiz. Pop Quiz, 18 Things to Know About Ancient Egypt. Agriculture centered on the cultivation of cereal crops, chiefly emmer wheat, Triticum dicoccum, and barley, Hordeum vulgar. The fertility of the land and general predictability of the inundation ensured very high productivity from a single annual crop. This productivity made it possible to store large surpluses against crop failures and also formed the chief basis of Egyptian wealth, which was, until the creation of the large empires of the 1st millennium BCE, the greatest of any state in the ancient Middle East. Basin irrigation was achieved by simple means, and multiple cropping was not feasible until much later times, except perhaps in the lakeside area of Al-Fayyum. As the river deposited alluvial silt, raising the level of the floodplain, and land was reclaimed from marsh, the area available for cultivation in the Nile Valley and Delta increased, while pastoralism declined slowly. In addition to grain crops, fruit and vegetables were important, the latter being irrigated year-round in small plots. Fish was also vital to the diet. Papyrus, which grew abundantly in marshes, was gathered wild and in later times was cultivated. It may have been used as a food crop, and it certainly was used to make rope, matting, and sandals. Above all, it provided the characteristic Egyptian writing material, which, with cereals, was the country's chief export in late-period Egyptian and then Greco-Roman times. Cattle may have been domesticated in northeastern Africa. The Egyptians kept many as draft animals and for their various products, showing some of the interest in breeds and individuals that is found to this day in the Sudan and Eastern Africa. The donkey, which was the principal transport animal, the camel did not become common until Roman times, was probably domesticated in the region. The native Egyptian breed of sheep became extinct in the 2nd millennium BCE and was replaced by an Asiatic breed. Sheep were primarily a source of meat, their wool was rarely used. Goats were more numerous than sheep. Pigs were also raised and eaten. Ducks and geese were kept for food, and many of the vast numbers of wild and migratory birds found in Egypt were hunted and trapped. Desert game, principally various species of antelope and ibex, were hunted by the elite. It was a royal privilege to hunt lions and wild cattle. Pets included dogs, which were also used for hunting, cats, and monkeys. In addition, the Egyptians had a great interest in, and knowledge of, most species of mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish in their environment. Most Egyptians were probably descended from settlers who moved to the Nile Valley in prehistoric times, with population increase coming through natural fertility. In various periods there were immigrants from Nubia, Libya, and especially the Middle East. They were historically significant and also may have contributed to population growth, but their numbers are unknown. Most people lived in villages and towns in the Nile Valley and Delta. Dwellings were normally built of mud brick and have long since disappeared beneath the rising water table or beneath modern town sites, thereby obliterating evidence for settlement patterns. In antiquity, as now, the most favored location of settlements was on slightly raised ground near the riverbank, where transport and water were easily available and flooding was unlikely. Until the 1st millennium BCE, Egypt was not urbanized to the same extent as Mesopotamia. Instead, a few centers, notably Memphis and Thebes, attracted population and particularly the elite, while the rest of the people were relatively evenly spread over the land. The size of the population has been estimated as having risen from 1 to 1.5 million in the 3rd millennium BCE to perhaps twice that number in the late 2nd millennium and 1st millennium BCE. Much higher levels of population were reached in Greco-Roman times. Nearly all of the people were engaged in agriculture and were probably tied to the land. In theory all the land belonged to the king, although in practice those living on it could not easily be removed and some categories of land could be bought and sold. Land was assigned to high officials to provide them with an income, and most tracts required payment of substantial dues to the state, which had a strong interest in keeping the land in agricultural use. Abandoned land was taken back into state ownership and reassigned for cultivation. The people who lived on and worked the land were not free to leave and were obliged to work it, but they were not enslaved. Most paid a proportion of their produce to major officials. Free citizens who worked the land on their own behalf did emerge. Terms applied to them tended originally to refer to poor people, but these agriculturalists were probably not poor. Slavery was never common, being restricted to captives and foreigners or to people who were forced by poverty or debt to sell themselves into service. Enslaved persons sometimes even married members of their owners' families, so that in the long term those belonging to households tended to be assimilated into free society. In the New Kingdom, from about 1539 to 1077 BCE, large numbers of captives were enslaved and acquired by major state institutions or incorporated into the army. Punitive treatment of enslaved foreigners or of native fugitives from their obligations included forced labor, exile, for example, the oases of the western desert, or compulsory enlistment in dangerous mining expeditions. Even non-punitive employment such as quarrying in the desert was hazardous. The official record of one expedition shows a mortality rate of more than 10%. Just as the Egyptians optimized agricultural production with simple means, their crafts and techniques, many of which originally came from Asia, were raised to extraordinary levels of perfection. The Egyptians' most striking technical achievement, massive stone building, also exploited the potential of a centralized state to mobilize a huge labor force, which was made available by efficient agricultural practices. Some of the technical and organizational skills involved were remarkable. The construction of the Great Pyramids of the 4th Dynasty, c. 2543, c. 2436 BCE, has yet to be fully explained and would be a major challenge to this day. This expenditure of skill contrasts with sparse evidence of an essentially Neolithic way of living for the rural population of the time, while the use of flint tools persisted even in urban environments at least until the late 2nd millennium BCE. Metal was correspondingly scarce, much of it being used for prestige rather than everyday purposes. In urban and elite contexts, the Egyptian ideal was the nuclear family, but, on the land and even within the central ruling group, there is evidence for extended families. Egyptians were monogamous, and the choice of partners in marriage, for which no formal ceremony or legal sanction is known, did not follow a set pattern. Consanguineous marriage was not practiced during the dynastic period, except for the occasional marriage of a brother and sister within the royal family, and that practice may have been open only to kings or heirs to the throne. Divorce was in theory easy, but it was costly. Women had a legal status only marginally inferior to that of men. They could own and dispose of property in their own right, and they could initiate divorce and other legal proceedings. They hardly ever held administrative office but increasingly were involved in religious cults as priestesses or chantresses. Married women held the title mistress of the house, the precise significance of which is unknown. Lower down the social scale, they probably worked on the land as well as in the house. The uneven distribution of wealth, labor, and technology was related to the only partly urban character of society, especially in the 3rd millennium BCE. The country's resources were not fed into numerous provincial towns but instead were concentrated to great effect around the capital itself, a dispersed string of settlements rather than a city, and focused on the central figure in society, the king. In the 3rd and early 2nd millennia, the elite ideal, expressed in the decoration of private tombs, was monorial and rural. Not until much later did Egyptians develop a more pronouncedly urban character.